Brilliant. So I'm just trying to move this so I can see. Great. Sorry, just I might just turn off my camera, Bridget, just because of my Wi-Fi connection. And just to say, should I disappear, I will reappear again very quickly, just because my Wi-Fi here in the West isn't always amazing. So I'll do that now. So hopefully I will stay here. Stop video. Yes, great. Okay. So if you haven't met myself before, I'm Amanda McGuinness. I'm a manager here in As I Am in relation to an upcoming app called Prepare Me. So that's probably as much as I'll say about myself, because I know everybody really is here to listen to the presentation. I suppose when we're talking about understanding a late diagnosis, I often prefer the language of identification. So for myself, I suppose I was identified in my 30s, and how that came about, I suppose I should say, first of all, I'm obviously autistic myself. I'm also a parent to 4 children, 3 of whom are autistic. My eldest child, Hayley, is a teenager. She's almost 16. She's not autistic, but my 3 sons are Connor, Jack, and Max. And for myself, maybe you noticed there at the start of the presentation, there's about a mountain of books behind me. I'm what you might call a researcher in regards to the type of autistic person that I am. I like to research it and learn as much as I can on, I suppose, on any special interest topic. But for myself, when my eldest son Connor was identified, he would have been one of the youngest children in County Mayo identified at the time, all those years ago. He's almost 14 now. So he would have been, identified as autistic before he was 1. So that would have been unheard of at the time. Maybe it's not so unheard of now, but back in those days it was. So for myself, once I realized that my son was autistic, I started to research. And the more that I read on autism, elements, and you can understand as well, maybe the language about autism 14 years ago wasn't as positive as it is now, wasn't as forward thinking or as progressive as it is now. So when I would read books and different pieces on and research papers on autism, it just seemed to be very negative. But there's elements that were true for my son, but the majority framed autism and my son being autistic very negatively. But there was many times I remember reading that research going, God, that's just like me, and I do that, and that's things that I would do. Then later my middle son Jack was born, and as Jack started to grow and develop, he was, I suppose my own father would say, he was the cut down of me as a child. He'd be very academic, very much into researching whatever his special interests are. And then socially, he would always have struggled a little bit. So same as I would have always found the social world a little bit confusing. And then later, my gorgeous Max, so I have my 3 gorgeous boys and my beautiful Hayley, my daughter. So when my youngest son Max was born, I was at that point already very aware that I was most likely autistic. But because I had spent, say, the last almost, Max is 6 now, say the last almost 8 years at that point, maybe longer, maybe 10 years at that point, researching autism to support my own children and going to professional trainings and, upskilling in the area myself professionally, I decided that maybe I had, obscured my own knowledge on autism, and maybe I was assuming I was autistic, but maybe I wasn't, because I'd read so much research. I thought maybe I had, confused myself and thought that I was autistic, just because of all my own researching. So because my brain is so, I suppose, analytical in that way, I decided over the last, I suppose, over a decade, I had attempted to go for autism assessments. And you can imagine, especially a decade ago, it was quite difficult to find anyone to go for an assessment. But different times I was able to locate individuals that provided assessments. And each time I would back out over, say, the course of a decade, because I might say to individuals that, I think I am autistic. And I would get lots of really unfortunate kind of negative reactions. And at the time I think, oh gosh, well, maybe I can't, maybe I'm wrong. But then I realized after my gorgeous Max was born, and he's 6 now, I thought, why am I always telling my own children how incredible it is to be themselves, whether it's my daughter that's not autistic or my 3 sons that are, I would say to myself, why am I always telling them it's such a great thing to be autistic and I'm so proud of you? But yet I knew inherently that I had grown up feeling different my whole entire life, but there wasn't a label for that feeling of difference that I had, or at least a definition somewhere that identified me as being whatever that feeling was. So at the point then that Max was identified and, I was supporting my own children, I decided then, because I often would find myself randomly actually quite unwell, but if I would go to a doctor or if I would go to the hospital, they could see I was very much, I suppose the language I would use now is burnt out. But back then they might have said very unwell, like just very exhausted, but they couldn't tell me why. And I would say, like, I don't know, like I'm doing everything right, but I feel so unwell all of the time. What I realize now looking back is that I was constantly on the verge of or actually in burnout. So the very last time I ever went ended up in casualty actually very unwell was, I think it was the Halloween before I went finally for that, finally kind of took the step to say, no, I'm actually going to go through the assessment this time, because prior to that I had cancelled 3 other appointments. And the final time was when I had landed into casualty again, very, very unwell. And for me, it was because I wanted to be at home with my children, but yet I found myself in casualty, unwell and not knowing why. And at that point, then it occurred to me that I actually needed to go for an assessment now and just find out, was I autistic, or what else was happening for me, or why was it that I couldn't anticipate that I was becoming unwell until the point I would end up in casualty. And I understand now, we'll say, because of interoception differences and alexithymia and different things, there would be reasons as to why I actually couldn't inherently or innately understand why I was feeling so unwell. So I finally did go for that assessment at the age of 39, and I'm 43 now. So that was just not that long ago, really. But for me, I suppose when I think about it, um, for me, really, it has changed my whole life since. And for me, the impetus, I suppose, for me to finally go was that moment of being in casualty. And actually, I spoke on my own YouTube channel about it about a year or two ago. And I was saying that I remember laying there on the bed in casualty waiting for the doctor to come in, just saying, this is the last time I'm going to be here. And also that was one element of it. And the other element of it was that during the pandemic, I had heard our incredible CEO, Adam Harris, speak so many times, and our deputy and many other individuals from the organization that are autistic, and speak so powerfully about their own experience of being autistic. And just, they were people that I admired greatly. And I thought, well, how can I admire Adam Harris and our deputy and all of these other incredible individuals, and yet adore my own children, and yet tell them how incredible it is to be autistic, and yet I myself have this sense of, if I find out I'm autistic, what does that mean for me? So I finally did go for that assessment, and I was identified as autistic. You'll see many of the slides, I'll just say now at this point, will have a character called Autie that I share online through my own social media called littlepuddins.ie. And for me, once I found out that I was autistic, I tried to really understand myself now, instead of always, and I'll speak to this a little bit later when I speak on trauma, instead of kind of saying when things were difficult for me that it was my fault and there was something with me that made it my fault. But what I realized later was that actually, no, it wasn't my fault that I had all these struggles all my life. It was just that I was a different type of human being. And I think when I say talk about autism or being autistic, I always touch my head and go, I have a different type of neurology. So for myself, once I realized that I was autistic, I started to draw a character Autie, and this is the character you'll see on screen. And so all of the slides will have imagery of Autie, because I'm speaking from my own lived experience, and that's really where Autie came about. And Autie had pink hair because I always wanted to have pink hair, and sadly the pink didn't stay too long on my hair, so I couldn't keep going with the pink hair for myself in my real life. But through my drawings, I can still live my happy dream of having pink hair. So for myself, it really was a journey of understanding that my own children were autistic, and then finally realizing that I needed to go for that assessment for my own well-being and for me to finally look after myself. So for me, I've kind of really spoken a little bit about that already. But for me, when I did finally go for that assessment, I thought, okay, all of the struggles and the, I suppose even unkindness or harsh words or stigmatization that my own sons have faced, I thought, I'm going to go for this assessment now and find out that if I am autistic, that all of the struggles that my sons have faced, this is, in inverted commas, my fault, because people have, over the years said unkind things or been kind of judgmental towards my children because they are different. And I had this fear that if I did go, what would that mean for me? But actually, what I found by going for that assessment was that actually it was the best thing that I ever could have done for myself. And I always say, I wish every person in the country that considers that they may be autistic, whether they're young, old, or whatever, that they have that opportunity to go for an assessment. And I hope someday in Ireland we do have that opportunity for every human being that deserves to really know themselves. But when I did go for that assessment, it was the most life affirming moment in my life. The way that the psychologist spoke to me about myself was just so positive. The things that I thought were, inverted commas, wrong with me, like for example, as I'm speaking tonight, I'm trying actively to slow down my speech, because as Bridget would tell you, I do speak very fast, and that's because I am what's also called a hyperfant. So I would have a very particular thinking style that I would say is very obviously very visual, but it's very it has really helped me throughout my whole life in that regard, but can be very overwhelming if I'm not regulated, because I'm thinking in pictures and video very, very quickly all of the time. And it's a great tool to help me thrive in lots of different areas of my life. But if I'm dysregulated, it can be hard for me to catch my thoughts, to think quickly and clearly. But for myself, when I went for that assessment, one of the first things he said to me was that I kept apologizing. And he said in the space of an hour, I had apologized, I think he said about 50 times. And I was like, oh, I'm terribly sorry. And he's like, don't apologize. I was like, sorry about that. And he was like, 51, 52. And he started to giggle. And I was laughing too, going, oh gosh, I didn't even know that I apologized. He said, stop apologizing for being yourself, because who you are is pretty incredible. And I was just, oh, sorry about that. He was like, no, stop saying you don't need to apologize for being yourself. And he was saying that I probably, from what I had told him, and what would say other individuals in my family who'd participated in that assessment had said, was that I was more aware probably than many other people in the world that I was different, because I was always trying so hard to fit in everywhere and trying to find my place everywhere. But he said, you actually belonged just being yourself all of the time, as opposed to trying to be like anybody else. I didn't need to be like anybody else anymore. And that was really life affirming for me. And when he spoke about, sorry, I just see there's a question there. Oh, great. Thank you. Sorry, I just saw it just in case there's any issue with the audio. And for myself, I found that one of the things that he said in relation to my speech, because I speak so fast, he said, do you realize that the way that you're processing information so quickly, that's why you're speaking so quickly? And he was saying that it's an incredible skill to have, to be able to think as quickly as I can and to learn all the skills. So for example, I've taught myself Portuguese many years ago when I needed to create something to help one of my sons that's non-speaking. It was actually a visual type of resource, but the incredible we'll say show, or it was a YouTube channel again back in the day. Connor's 14 now. They didn't have Google Translate back in the day, or at least I didn't know how to use it back then. So I learned languages when I needed to learn them. I learned skill sets. I learned graphic design. I couldn't even tell you the amount of random skill sets that I have, but I've learned them because of my mind. And yet I was so afraid of my mind because it wouldn't allow me to slow down my speech. But once I spoke to that psychologist, and he explained about the way that I think, and in relation to be a hyperfant or hyperphantasia is the way that my mind processes information, that then I suddenly understood why it was, for example, when I studied at university for law, when all of my, say, colleagues, or I would say colleagues, course mates, or whatever the right language is, would write notes, I would draw pictures and I would learn off the case law, or that I have a photographic memory, that once I could see it, and if it triggered me to have an interest in what I could see, I could remember it. And he was explaining all of this to me in such positive terms that suddenly I realized that, it is a great, and I always said to my children, it was a great thing to be autistic. But for myself, I thought he was going to say I had some kind of deficits or something like that, but he actually empowered me to see that everything that I had experienced that was a challenge wasn't actually my fault. I was living in a world that wasn't actually created for people like me, but that thanks, in modern day times now, I can see that thanks to the incredible As I Am and colleagues like my, wonderful friend Bridget, everybody working together to create a better and fairer Ireland for all of us is really what's made the difference. So that's where I kind of came about, was wondering for myself, for my own children, to where I am now. And then often people would say, well, how was it that you may not have been identified growing up? And this is, when I think about now understanding a late in life diagnosis, I have spent a lot of time kind of ruminating over, why was it that nobody noticed that I was autistic? And I suppose a lot of it does come back to maybe the way that I presented myself to the world, or the way maybe people had stereotypical notions of. For example, I would identify as a female woman, and as a young girl growing up, many individuals, especially possibly in Ireland, might have thought that it was more typical for a girl to maybe excel academically, which I did, to be shy, which I certainly was one of the words that, or phrases, that the psychologist used to describe me was that I was socially avoidant. I would avoid as much as I possibly could going out socially. I would, in my family, I'm one of 11. I've basically gone to 0 family weddings, bar I think 2. I've avoided nearly everyone's children's christening. And it's not that I don't love and adore my family, because I'm very close to all of my family. But for me, I find it so overwhelming, and always did, even growing up. If there was family occasions, I would generally try to avoid them. I would always have been a people pleaser, because for me, if you were like me growing up, I was hyper aware that I was different, but I didn't know why I was different, or why it was I was trying so hard. I could get A's academically, but in the social world, I remember I had a book in secondary school called the Book of Transformation. And I would go into school every day and I would observe everybody else. And again, that's the research part of me that is a researcher. I would notice everything. As I mentioned there in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen, where it says I hid my social research and journals, I would go in and notice my classmates and see what they were doing and how they were saying things. And I would write it down. And I would say, for example, well, Mary said X, Y, and Z, and everyone laughed. Tomorrow I'm going to say the same thing. And then everybody will laugh. And then I'll feel like I belong here. And it wasn't that my classmates weren't lovely, because they really were very kind and caring. And I was very lucky for the schools that my parents had sent me to. So I was lucky. And I do know that's not everyone's experience. So I suppose I would go in the next day then with that research and think, well, I'll say it now and then it'll work out great for me. And then I'll suddenly have this feeling of I belong too. But actually, obviously, the way that I would just utter a phrase I'd heard the day before didn't really fall in fluidly into those social dynamics the way I had hoped that they might. Because obviously, when those words or that language had been used the day before, it wasn't really on par, on point the next day when I would say it. Let me see, is there anything else there I could touch on? For example, myself and Bridget were talking about fidgets before the call went live, and I was saying, oh, I have a lovely avocado shaped fidget I can show you afterwards. It's just a pop-up, but I like it. For me, when I was in school, I would always try and just sit there and be the best student that I thought I could be. But by the time I would get home, I would just have so much energy inside of me. I would often come in the door and I would say, God help my parents, I would be like a volcano of I suppose retained energy all day long at school, and trying to get everything that I was holding in all day long in words, and I would just, everything would come out. And that's, for me, was definitely not helpful to not be able to stim openly. Whereas now, obviously, I fidget around or move around or do whatever I need to do to help myself. For example, I'll go on to the next one. So for me, looking back after having, gone for an assessment, and what I do want to say is that for many people, having the opportunity to go for assessment isn't actually always available. And that is a terrible thing. If we do want to go for one and we can't actually access one, it is a terrible thing. But for me, I for a very long time knew that I was different. And in the last, say, 10 years up until I went for that assessment, I was pretty sure that I was autistic. But because of my own knowledge base, I felt I couldn't trust, and that would be a strong sense I always used to have, that I couldn't trust my own feelings, because I always got things inverted commas wrong, I thought. I obviously know that to be different now. But just to say that whether you can access an assessment or you cannot, if you're identifying as autistic, self-identification is valid, and don't feel that you absolutely have to go for an assessment unless it's something that you really feel you need to go for. For myself, it was just because I felt I couldn't trust my own thought processes about myself, because that had always been the way I had felt growing up. So for me, it was important that I could do that. Again, maybe you might find yourself in this little cycle, or maybe you won't. For myself, I often find that I suppose for myself, I often find that I'm in this kind of circular cycle of, oh yeah, this is great, I'm autistic, this is fantastic. And then I start to look back and think, God, I had many moments in my life where people misjudged what I said, or if someone asked me a question, I would always give an honest answer. It would never occur to me that they would even consider for a moment that I meant anything negatively, because I never would. I would always just try to be honest and kind all of the time. But often I would have had moments of difficulty, or where people would not believe that because I was so academic that I could possibly have made, inverted commas, my language now, excuse me, a stupid mistake, whatever, socially. They would say, you did that on purpose because you know well. And they would say, I know well because academically I was more or less a straight A student, especially in the latter part of my secondary schooling and obviously into university. They couldn't believe that it would be possible that I would have misinterpreted what they said. Yet now it's very accepted that if you're speaking to me, that, especially if you know me, that I take language, pinpoint literally. So just to, often I'll say, can I just clarify? That's what I would say now. But back in the day, I would just try and be like, oh yeah, I know what you're saying. But then I wouldn't have no idea what was really being said, or if there was any kind of, inference that I should be picking up, or, we think about nuanced language, I wasn't picking up any, it was invisible to me. And I always think, when you think about social intuition, I didn't have social intuition. And then later, and this is a process that even now, again, I find myself thinking about, oh, well, I really like X. And then I think, well, do I really like reading, or is that just something I was doing because I found socializing so difficult? So I decided I'd read books instead. So as it happens, I do, in fact, love to read books. And myself and Bridget often talk about books as well, and all the many books that I have here in the office. So for myself, I do often find myself now and again, and maybe you might find yourself doing that as well, or maybe you don't, and that's okay too. But I will often find myself in cycles, or, thoughts coming back to me of maybe a difficult moment, and thinking, God, that was difficult. But the good thing that has taught me since is that I have so much self-compassion. And now if I do have a difficult moment, or if I have, as I would say, a social catastrophe or a social blunder, I just say to myself, well, that was an autism moment. I can move on with my life now, and I won't ruminate over it again. Whereas when I was younger, it would just, inverted commas, it would kill me to be like, why did I do that? Or why didn't I know? There was a reason why I did the thing, and there was a reason why I didn't know. And that was because I was autistic. And that wasn't fair for me to have not known that I was autistic, but also now that I do know, it's a great thing to have that knowledge base for myself, because now I am able to look after myself. And I'll speak to that a little bit more further down the line. But for myself, it means now that when I do find myself thinking like, this is incredible that I'm autistic, and it is incredible, and then I'm looking back at, say, difficult moments, or questioning myself, why is that? At least for me, I have a framework now through which to understand myself. And I just find it so empowering and so, I suppose, affirming that I can understand myself now in a totally different light, and not allow myself to be unkind or to blame myself for difficulties that I will always have. So I'll always have difficulties understanding, say, the social world. I'll always have difficulties trying to process what people are saying verbally if I can't process it visually. And you'll see there are just a few slides on, again, these slides I can send out afterwards if anyone would like them. Again, for myself, when I think about visual thinking, what has actually helped me all of my life was the fact that I could think so quickly. And the reason I could think so quickly was because I was thinking visually. Whereas if you had sent me, so for example, I studied law at university initially, and when I was studying law, when my colleagues, or say colleagues, there's probably a better name, my college friends might be the language, when they would have been studying, say, statute or whatever, a precedent, they might be writing down whatever the judge had said or whatever the statute was. For me, I used to just go down, and actually, if you saw my desk, I have multiple yellow highlighters here in the desk. I would use a black pen and I would use yellow highlighters. Now, again, this is just my own strategy. And for myself, I would just highlight say the piece of text on statute that I needed to know, and I would highlight it in a particular yellow. Well, I can't even say the brand, STABILO, stabilo. I'm sure I said that wrong. Highlight it and then write the word here, and I would look at the page a few times and make sure I could see it in my mind's eye. And if I could, then I knew I would see it forever. I'm just thinking, so a question there, someone said, does everybody think visually? Not every autistic person does, but we do know through the research that there is a great many autistic people that have visual processing strengths. So when we think about a spectrum, there's also a visual thinking spectrum. On one end, there's the absolute opposite of hyperphantasia. There's aphantasia. So that's individuals that never think in any type of imagery. And then the other end would be, and I don't like the word extreme because it sounds a little bit medicalized, but the opposite, the complete polar opposite of aphantasia then would be hyperphantasia. So I'd be what's known as a hyperphant. If you've ever heard of Temple Grandin, a lot of what she speaks to is about being a hyperphant or hyperphantasia. And then there's the middle ground where individuals can think in words and in pictures. And many of us, and it's not like, the only way I can describe it is, for me, it's like I'm back in the memory again. So when I spoke to the psychologist about it, he was asking about how I process information. And I was saying, for example, I was saying, well, you know, the way the reels play at the end of the day. And he said, the reels, what are they like? And I was saying, well, depending on the day and how relaxed I am going to sleep, I can replay the whole day. And I was describing, which I can describe now if you don't find it boring, is for myself, is that if I'm falling asleep at nighttime, and again, if I'm sleepy enough, I can still kind of remember before I fall asleep, is that in my mind, everything is completely black for a moment. And then it's like on a little, and again, this might sound a bit bizarre, but this is how it is for myself. I can then see like the whole day play back as if it's on a reel, and I can stop and start it, and I can see different elements of it. Now, I won't remember every single thing, but the key pieces that stuck out to me for the day, I can stop and start and look at it. And I thought, again, that this was something that everybody thought like, but I didn't understand that this was hyperphantasia. Or for example, the way that I have a photographic memory, or I met one of my son's teachers. I won't identify which one. One of my sons had changed school in the last number of years, and I had met his new teacher, who happened to have been training when my son was in primary school. And I said, "Oh my gosh, did you work in X school when my son X was, in that school?" And he said, "That's right, I did my training." I said, "That's right, you wore a beige suit." And he just went, I did actually. And I was like, "Yeah." And I said, "That was 10 years ago." He's like, "Yeah." And then I went, "Oh gosh, that was probably my autism moment for the day." But I just went, "Thanks, it was a nice suit." And I went home, and I'm sure the man was like, "What was that about?" But for myself, it's because if it's something that I find interesting in the moment, I will remember it till time ends visually. A number of years ago, and I'll just watch my time, a number of years ago, and I won't speak too long here, about visual processing strengths. And if you're an autistic person thinking, you know, what's so great about having visual processing strengths? For myself, I was able to find a missing person in America where somebody came to me here in my own house. I knew their own, say, daughter very well, and a person was missing. I won't identify the location, in a place in America. And the daughter had said to the father, because it would say that it was a brother that was missing, that, oh, if you talk to Amanda McGuinness, she's a great memory. She would have followed him. These would have been people I would know very well, would follow him online and might have seen his stories on Instagram or whatever, and she might be able to find out where he was, because this young person, again, I have permission to speak about this, would have bipolar disorder, and when the person wouldn't take their medication, they would actually lose the sense of who they are, and they would get lost and could end up injured or hurt. So this would be an adult. So when the father came, I thought, okay, I'll try and help, but like, I don't know what I gleaned from that person's stories on that particular day, but if I can remember. So I was able to track back visually in my mind to where I saw them posting, like, and it wasn't something I would actively look to remember anyone's stories. But I think that particular day, what was going up was so unusual, as in how quickly the person was posting different locations where they were, that it stuck on my mind as I will often say, interesting. So when the father came, I actually said to him, did he want to go out to sit with my husband and have a cup of tea while I was here in the office trying to remember what I could see? And I started searching online through what I could see in my mind. And what I didn't know was that he'd actually gone outside the office door here and was still listening to me. And I didn't understand that he was listening to me. And I kept saying to myself, no, stop, look back, go back, go back. So in my head, I was telling myself to go back to what I could see the day before and what was on the screen in my mind, and what could I see the person captioning. And one area, he had like, I can't think of the right language now, but basically he was out in a wilderness area, but there was the name of a sheriff's like car or something in the background. So I rang that location, and I rang that particular sheriff's office, and they hadn't any report of anyone missing. And I rang and I rang and I rang. And then at one point he had something up, I think it was about a pizza parlor or something. And I thought, that's very unusual, because that's far away from where that other, you know, the open wilderness place that he was. So I rang around and I started to ring around to all the different sheriffs. And because my background is obviously legal, I knew that they probably couldn't give me too much information. So I thought if I could answer them questions in circles, they could give me information. So I said, well, could I ask you then to confirm? So in the end, I was actually able to identify this missing person 500 miles away from where the family were searching for him in America. And I've never been to either of those locations where the person was missing. And I was calling in the father then, but he came in the door crying, because I didn't realize he was the other side of the door. And he said, that's the most incredible thing I've ever seen and heard, that they had been looking for him for a week and I had found him within an hour. And he was unfortunately quite unwell in an institution, but they were able to find him and he's back in Ireland now. So you talk about autistic strengths. I could do that because I now understood that I was autistic and could understand how to support my own strengths. And one of those strengths is obviously visual processing, and in particular hyperphantasia and having a photographic memory. But again, it's only where something has garnered my interest that really kicks in very strongly. Again, as I often say, one of the biggest struggles I've always had and will always have is that I communicate differently and I understand language differently. But what's also been super helpful for me is that now that I know that, now that I'm able to understand that I am autistic, despite it being a later in life identification, because I know that about myself, now I can support myself. And now if someone's speaking to me, I'll be able to say to myself, well, hold on, before you react, or if someone's asking me to do something, I double check. I either ask them myself, can they clarify, or I double check myself later. Were they being literal? Did I interpret exactly what they were saying? And then I can, react if there's something I'm instructed to do or something I have to do. I can really think about it. Then I also think about, often when other people are communicating verbally with me, I might often say, can I ask you, do you mean this, that, or the other? And it's great to be able to clarify. So for me, socially understanding, say, body language and visual communication, say around, I'll often look at eyebrows and be like, I wonder what the eyebrows are saying. Or for myself, the fact that if I'm talking at length, I don't know even right now, when should I stop or when should I start? So for myself, I try to say, I give myself strategies to try and figure out, does the person want me to keep talking or not? And if it's a person I know very well, I'll be like, if I said too much, or will I keep on there? And everyone's always kind of like, no, keep, I'm listening, or whatever it is. So for myself, I don't have a fear now of saying I don't understand, or can I ask you a question? Because I also have an English degree and I'm actually studying a master's at the moment in speech and language. So for me, I could have all of this academic knowledge, but then day to day, I find the most, what another person might never think would be difficult, I find it super difficult. So if you are a parent or the loved one of an autistic person watching this evening, always think about your language and how you're communicating with the person, and wherever you can, providing clarity and, giving them support, because it is really quite a difficult thing to wake up in the world every single day, and every single day trying to translate the verbal world, the body language of another individual, the non-verbal communication. And it's a constant thing that I'm doing all the time. I'm self-monitoring myself all of the time. And this evening I'm slowing down my speech, but I'm actively reminding myself to not speak too fast, so that hopefully by the time this presentation is over, you won't have fallen asleep listening to me bored, but also that you will have hopefully been able to understand what I'm saying. Because when I would have been younger, many times people would say, "Oh, you're mumbling, can you speak clearly?" And then in the end, I would go kind of situationally mute, because I would be like, I don't want another person to tell me to communicate clearly or to stop mumbling, or why can't I know often when I was very young, the odd person might say, "Why can't you speak properly?" And in my mind, I was speaking slowly, but because, and this is where the psychologist was really, really helpful. He said to me that, he said, the reason that you speak so fast is because you're processing information so quickly, and your words can't keep up with how quickly that you think. And then it's all coming out together all at once, because you're trying to not miss one of the imagery or one of the movies that you can see, are like mini movie clips in your mind, and you're trying to find words. He said, actually, that's an incredible strength that you have, that you can translate that amount of information or learn things that quickly and then translate it out into the world again. So for me, again, going for that assessment or understanding that I was autistic was such a major thing. Another thing that has really helped me really understand a late in life identification or diagnosis, depending on the language that you prefer, is really understanding and embracing autistic culture. And remember, every person has, different cultures, whether it's, to do with their family culture, their personal culture, it's all very different. But in specific to autistic culture, I started to realize that many of the things that I really enjoy are quite common, not in every faction of the autistic community, but across the autistic community. So, for example, the piece there that says objects collections are incredibly meaningful. Many of my friends will tell you, I will never lend you a book, but if I really like you and you really like the book that I'm telling you about, I'll go buy you the book. But my books, in a sense, are an extension of myself, even though you might say it's only a book. But if I've shown Bridget earlier with the camera on my screen, all the books that I have in just one or two sections of my office, it's floor to ceiling all around me. And they're all generally on autism or autism related topics. But for me, it's very rare. I think I've lent out autism related books maybe twice or three times in my life. And only to very close friends, because I know that they understand that it's not just a book to me, it's something that I value deeply. Another thing might be, and we were also speaking about this earlier, myself and Bridget, that choosing sensory safe clothing. It's very rare that you would see me ever not wearing black of some form. For me, I just prefer black, because visually, again, you might notice on this presentation when I have the camera back on, I generally find visual information incredibly interesting, because I learn it very quickly or receive it very quickly, but also can be very overwhelming. So for me, when it comes to clothing, if I'm, say, supporting an autistic young person one-to-one, I generally am hyper aware of what I'm wearing if I'm supporting the person, because I know if they're like myself, and not every person is, visually what I'm wearing can even be, I suppose, distracting, or what I might call, and talk about messaging, visually disturb the messaging of whatever it is I'm saying or doing. So for myself, I will often always wear black clothing for visual processing reasons, but also from a sensory perspective as well. Something else I could point out. But for me, really, when I think about culture, it has really helped me embrace the fact that I'm autistic. And for example, I don't know, I'm much older, I'm sure, than many people listening on the call, but back in the day, I used to listen to CDs. And if you wanted to listen to a CD on repeat, you had to press a button on your, what was called, I think it was a Discman or something. I used to listen to songs, I was actually Oasis back in the day, on repeat until I'd fall asleep. And then I'd wake up and switch it off. And the only way that I even now can really go to sleep if I'm listening to something on repeat. But I found out when I really delved into autistic culture, that's very common across the community to rewatch movies. I think I've watched the movie Three Men and a Little Baby probably thousands of times, and it's not that it's becoming more interesting each time. It's just a safe, lovely movie that I remember watching with my dad when I was young. And when I want to feel that feeling again, I'll repeat watch something like that. Or it's like a sense of safety that it brings. And same with the music on repeat. And just as anyone else that has a mind like mine watching the call. And again, this is just my own personal strategy. When I do need to slow down my mind to go to sleep, I'll put on a song on repeat. And then that will actually slow down my mind, because I'll start to listen to the music and think about whatever I'm thinking about in the song. And then often I will fall asleep more easily. Again, that doesn't work for every person. That's something that I do personally, and it does work for me. Again, and just for anyone watching, I'm just going to speak about trauma now. So if anybody finds trauma, difficult, or difficult friendship type topics, maybe don't listen now. And I think I'm moving on to masking after that. So I'm just watching my time. I suppose for myself, one of the biggest elements when I'm thinking about looking back on a late in life diagnosis is that piece around trauma. And we don't have enough time tonight to talk about trauma, but I'll just touch on it here. And one of the biggest things for me, probably no shock to anyone, would be, socialization and trauma. Yeah, sorry, I just saw a question there and I will reply to that afterwards. So when we're talking about trauma, again, it's everybody's experience is so individual. But for myself, my biggest trauma was always trying to have friends and then finding out that when you think, obviously, when you think of a friend, or maybe not obviously, I used to feel that if had a friend, then I could just be myself and I didn't have to hold in all my words and I didn't have to hold in that I like to move around and chat a lot, or talk about probably books a lot as well. But what I would find was that I would think that it was okay to be myself with whoever the person was, and then later I might find out they might have said something unkind, or might just be directly unkind to me, or tell me to stop talking about whatever the book was. And again, I can't blame every person. It also means that for me, during those times, I didn't fully understand, say, that if you have a friend, sometimes the friend might like to talk about, especially when I was younger, whatever their topics were, but I would just talk all day long, probably still would, about topics that I'm interested in. So for me, when I look back now, a lot of things that come up for me were difficulties that I had in friendships. And then also the fact that over time, because if you're like myself, if you had lots of difficulties with friendships, what I mean by difficulties were more misunderstandings. And then wondering why I had a friend and then the friendship ended and I never really did know why. And that would have happened countless times over the course of my life, even though I really valued those friendships, but they would always just seem to end and I wouldn't really know why. But I was very lucky in that I have one or two, I think two or three maybe, childhood friends that are still my friends to this day. And not that surprisingly, they are kind of mothering friends, but I adore them. And then I would have made some incredible friends, especially here in As I Am as well, which is just wonderful. But for myself, one of the biggest things that comes up for me a lot is when we talk about autistic trauma, and trauma will be different for every person. For me, it's generally always around I suppose really it's about the things that people found difficult about me, which really are elements of my autistic self, say fidgeting, the fact that I talked too fast, just all those comments, or being left out of things and thinking that maybe I was invited and then finding out I wasn't, and not understanding ever why. So for myself, one of the biggest things that does come up for me now is there's lots of things that I'm remembering, and because my mind is so visual, and that's one piece around hyperphantasia, is that if you are a hyperphant, when you're experiencing, and maybe even if you're not a hyperphant, for many autistic people, when you're remembering, it's like you're remembering right now that it's happening right now, and you're remembering it all over again right now. So for myself, I find that quite difficult now and again, but for myself, it's great to have good friends now to talk to, or if you have a partner to talk to them, or a loved one to talk to them. So for myself, that's one thing to maybe consider, that when you do have later in life identification, that maybe you might find yourself looking back, and that's okay, because sometimes it's a great thing to process and understand, and also reframe those experiences and, well, actually, those difficulties that I had, they weren't actually my fault. They were actually that I had a communication difference, and it probably wasn't the other person's fault either. It was that, if you think of Dr. Damien Milton's double empathy theory, really it was two different types of human beings, two different types of neurotypes coming together, socializing, interacting, and not fully understanding each other's perspective, and maybe not fully having that double empathy, enough empathy for each other, and trying to be supportive and kind. My dad would often say, and it's something that I still remember to this day, he would always say, be careful with your words. You never know how they may fall upon a person. And then he would say that I was always trying so hard all of the time to be kind and nice to everyone. He would always say, keep a little bit of that kindness back, because he said, if you give away all your kindness, you'll have none left for yourself. So when I think of looking back now on all of those difficult situations, I think of the kindness that I was putting out into the world, but I wasn't protecting my own kindness and looking after myself. So that's one thing to really be aware of, that you might find yourself, when maybe you realize now or in the future that you might be, or that you are autistic, is that you might find yourself looking back, and that's okay. Again, it's just something that does come up a lot, especially when I'm talking to community members, even on my own social media through my work here and As I Am. And then another huge piece is around masking and unmasking. And again, we won't have really a lot of time to talk about this, but I do believe there could be a webinar coming up on this, if I'm not mistaken, that will be in much more detail. But I suppose for myself, one of the biggest things outside of trauma that came up was really understanding masking, and wondering about what parts of my life, looking back, especially retrospectively, was I really being myself, or was I masking? And now that I've, a stronger knowledge base on masking myself, even as a professional, I really I can nearly identify it within myself when I am masking now and when I'm not. But I can remember so many times when I was younger going into school, and especially primary school, preparing to go in and preparing what I would say and how I'd react and what my face should look like. And it really was all masking. And again, you know, I think it's Kieran Rose. Actually, it is. He's incredible on masking, Dr. Amy Pearson. When I think about masking now and I look back, I think in a lot of ways it did save me in the moment, some situations, but in the long run, the masking it can make you kind of, it's almost like disassociation from who you are. When I think about when I went for that assessment with the psychologist, I went to him because I felt like I couldn't trust my own voice or my own thoughts and what I believed to be true about myself. When I think about masking it, I do feel like that did play an element of it, because I'd spent my whole life trying to be one particular type of a person that I felt everyone needed me to be, and then I would feel accepted. But obviously that wasn't to be the case. But what I will say, and this is something that maybe you found, or that maybe you will or you won't find in the future, is that when I did go for that assessment and when he was so positive, empowering, and affirmative about the fact that I was autistic, was that I remember literally directly afterwards, I had always this kind of sense of searching. I need to search, I need to find the answer. What is the answer about why I'm so different? That I do remember after that assessment, that searching feeling, it stopped immediately. And it was like something had, a door had closed and I didn't need to keep searching now. Now I had the answer. And that might sound very dramatic, but I can only equate it to, like, there was lots of me thinking lots of questions in my mind and hearing them all the time and wondering all of the time and all of the time thinking about it. And then once I was identified as autistic, and again, so again, I keep saying it because it's true, self-identification is valid. But in my particular scenario, I really needed somebody that didn't know me to tell me what he thought or she thought or they thought. And so for myself, I just distinctly remember that the chatter that I could hear in my mind, wondering, and because again, my mind is so research based, wondering and thinking and pondering, it's like I can just, if you think of a loud clap, which I won't do on the call, it was like the door shut with a loud clap. And then that was it. That noise went. And from that point onwards, I started to just start to accept myself. And that's really for me to help me unmask. And again, masking is such a huge topic that we wouldn't have time to speak on it tonight. Um, but what I will say is that for myself, what's been really helpful, and it was nearly like serendipitous that I started to work for As I Am professionally about a year after. First of all, I was actually very proud to have been a member of the board of As I Am, and then later and was added to, I suppose. I joined the team professionally about a year or so after that. So for me, what's really helped me to unmask is to be surrounded by positive autistic culture and identity. And I've clearly found that in As I Am. You couldn't find it anywhere better. It's incredible. But for me, I was able to embrace who I am by working in As I Am. So every day I was surrounded by incredible autistic people like Bridget and other individuals. And I was able to just fully be myself all of the time. Another thing was that I started to really, embrace obviously autistic culture. That definitely helped me to unmask, but also the things that I thought, oh God, you should really wear the things that maybe other moms wear. You should do the thing that other people your age do. Now I was like, no, but what's good for me to do? So I started to wear the sensory safe clothing. I made sure that, so for example, our home is our haven. So I'm obviously, our household, there's 6 of us, and the majority of the household are autistic. So we make sure that home is the haven, not just for the autistic people in the household, but everybody. So we generally wouldn't have visitors come into the house. The house is very sensory safe as much as we can, because there's a variety of autistic people and non-autistic. We make it very sensory safe and very, I would actually just call it humankind. It's very much about accepting each other and being kind. And it's not the Waltons or some fantastical world that we live in, but it's as kind and as caring as we can be for each other, and as accepting of each other as we can be. And obviously with children, they often have squabbles as well. But for myself personally, around masking and unmasking, my home is my haven. And as soon as I can get home again, I'm always, wherever I am in the world, wherever I am in Ireland, I'm always trying to get home again, because home is not only just to be with my children and my family, but also it's where I feel most like myself. So home is our haven. Again, I suppose speaking to autistic self-care, again, it is really about, for myself, it is clearly books. For myself, for you might be something different. For me, it really is delving deep into special interests. So I was chatting to Bridget earlier and saying I was designing graphics just before the call related to something for work that I was doing. Like, another person might be like, I might watch his show. I was like, actually, I'll design some new graphics. I really want to get those done. And also graphic design, again, visually is just very up my street as regards special interest. So for me, self-care, that's one thing I would recommend, that you really look at what is actually really And if you're like, well, what is self-care really? The way I look at it is what makes me feel most like myself, what makes me feel most like my feet are on the ground and I'm my true self that I can be. And again, that would be different for everyone. So for example, rewatching, as I mentioned earlier, old movies or listening to songs and repeat, learning to say no, which is hugely difficult for me because I'm definitely still a people pleaser. But as much as I can now, I'll say, well, I can't. And I probably will apologize and say, sorry, I can't because, but I'm learning info dumping. If I can find someone that wants to listen to a new book I've read on autism, I'll do that. Researching your interests, engaging in special interest, resting, which I find incredibly difficult because I'm on the go all the time. And that's just the way I like to be. But when I do rest, random side note for myself, the only thing that stops my brain researching and thinking is watching the most random TikToks because I think it's very quick fire, like nearly stimulation. So I just look and go, what was that? And then I move on to the next. I don't recommend it, TikTok professionally, but for myself personally, it's helpful. Understanding that if I do have to do anything social, and I mean outside the domain of the house, and that could be just going to Tesco on a busy Saturday afternoon, actually, which I did do this past weekend, and my daughter Haley was gone some visiting her friends. And when she came back, I said, you won't believe it, I had to go to Tesco to get shopping and I didn't get a chance to go in the morning. I actually went in the afternoon. She was like, wow, I don't know when you've last done that. And I was like, I don't know either. But I spent then the rest of the evening totally relaxing, in the dark, not without my children, but just relaxing, watching people watching a film or something. I made sure that I wasn't doing anything else social for the rest of the evening. So understanding that autistic social hangover is real. And what that really means is you're taking in like the sensory world, the communication world, the visual world, the social world. I just call it, as it's like high impact when you're outside the door of my house. It's like high impact constantly and trying to navigate that constantly all of the time and filter it as much as you can just to live and exist in the world. So for me, I know that once I'm away from whatever that scenario is, I need to go into probably my office if my kids are in bed or settled somewhere else in the house that they're happy enough that I can pop in here for a little while. So that's some of the things that I would do. Another thing, and I kind of mentioned this already, is that making your home, if that's what you would like to do, your haven. So for me, we don't have any visitors. It's not that I don't like it. Now we would have maybe grannies and granddads and potentially aunties and uncles, because all the aunties and uncles have kids now. They have little kids that come in and disturb all of my gorgeous, gorgeous puddins sorry, I call my children puddins, all of my children's lining up or books or things that they like. So what I try to do is instead say, well, actually, we could meet you somewhere or do something with you outside the home or whatnot. What I have learned, and I think this is from, I think it's The Perks of Being a Wallflower, one of the books I read years ago. I thought it was so true when I read it. It said, we accept the love we think we deserve. And if you don't have a strong sense of loving your own self and believing that you deserve kindness too, as my dad would have said, keep a little bit of kindness back, you might find yourself thinking that it's okay that somebody isn't kind to you, or it's okay that people don't say nice things to you or speak badly of you. You might think, well, I used to feel like, oh, that's because, I did get that thing wrong and I did say that the wrong way. Maybe they misunderstood me. I do say things wrong all the time. But I've learned now is actually, communication is a two-way street, or social interaction. It takes two people to socially interact. That actually sometimes maybe it wasn't something that I did or said, and maybe it was just, the double empathy theory. Maybe it was just that we'd misinterpreted each other. So for myself now, I try as much as I can to only surround myself with people that I know that do accept me as much as possible. And again, I'm very lucky in my work environment because that you couldn't get better for that. And then my home environment is obviously very positive. Again, another great thing that has really been helpful for me and even as a parent is understanding autistic love languages and looking at the way that we support and love each other. So in the house, my gorgeous Max, my 6-year-old, when I think of deep pressure, I always think of him. I could be sitting on the couch and I'll find this 6-year-old gorgeous little boy flying into me for the biggest hug. And he could only for, I'm not too small myself, he'd probably knock me off the couch. Or penguin pebbling, which if you don't know what that is, that might be, and again, it's different for everybody. For me, it would be if, say, somebody had said to me that I care about, I really like pebbles from the beach in Westport. And if I'm in the West, so if I happen to be in Westport, I might find and this is very literal now, actually, a pebble in Westport, I might give it to them. I'd say, I remembered, and it could have been 3 years ago, they said that you said you liked pebbles, and I found these and I gave them to you. And that's a very literal interpretation, but it could be anything. Learning to be yourself around people that you love and that love you back is a great thing. And for me, that's me at home. I'm totally myself at home. Body doubling, so I often see my sons do that. And I was talking about this last night in a different webinar where my two youngest sons, Jack and Max, they love marble runs, and can squabble because they are two young boys, but they'll also sit on the floor together, neither of them speaking or talking to each other or interacting or appearing not to interact at all, but they'll sit on the floor together, and there's such a peaceful calm and love in the room that they're just doing their own thing together, but in a sense separate. And that's kind of body doubling again. And then obviously being able to openly stim and just be yourself. And then spending spoons, that for me would be if one of my colleagues asked me, Neve in particular, was saying, oh, could you help me with that? I down tools, like, yeah, absolutely. So for me, I'd spend my spoons on people. So spoons, if you don't know, would be like, it's like energy accounting. So I would use some of my energy, some of my spoons to support, say, Neve, Mel, or Adam, or anybody else really in the charity. If anybody asked me that I have a great friendship with, I'd be like, absolutely, anything you need, anyone outside of the charity in my own personal life, I'd be like, yeah, of course I will. Sometimes to the detriment of myself. And that's again where we're learning about the boundaries, going, I can still be a good friend and I can still help, my personal life, but I also need to maybe, as my dad would say, keep a little bit back. So I keep a little bit of that positivity and kindness back. So that's just something to think about around self-care. And again, I suppose the main thing that you're aiming to do for yourself now is what's called autistic stability and safety. And that comes from Dr. Luke Bearden. And I actually have all his books because I think he's incredible. But he speaks to autistic global stability, and that's creating that feeling of safety for the autistic person all of the time, and providing those strong foundations that the person might need. So for myself, that's absolutely embracing stimming. It's for my children, for example, making sure that if we did have a visitor, that they don't disturb. In particular, one of my sons loves to line up little objects, and they're like the holy grail. I don't disturb them. If I'm attempting badly to hoover or sweep the floor, I make sure I move around those things, because I know that they're not just objects to him, they're meaningful pieces that feel like a really just a really wholesome, they're like an extension of himself. I think of books and myself. I know where, even though this room's a bit messy, I know where every book and every educational resource related to autism is, essentially, mainly because of my mind being I suppose photographic, but also because I know where I put things and why I put them there, even if it looks messy. Again, I spoke to the piece around making home the haven, and for me, it's my job now, my role now as an autistic person, is creating that stability for myself, and obviously for my children, but in a personal context for myself. And what that might look like is saying no to, maybe if someone asks me to do something, say no, I actually can't, or not allowing myself to go to environments where I can't stim, or I have to be so watchful of my words that it actually, as I would say, it does me in, or it makes me feel very unwell. So for myself, it's creating those kind of pieces around autistic stability. And again, it's going to be different for every person, but what you're really thinking about autistic stability, what you're really saying, I'm going to watch my time, what you're really saying, and I better go after this and move to the next slide, is you're trying to find that space in your life where, or that community, or that family space, or whatever it is, where you can feel most like yourself, where you can feel most grounded. I always think, when I think of grounded, I wear Doc Marten boots when I'm presenting in person because I feel very grounded, where you can feel most pulled to the ground, where you're feeling good, secure, happy, safe, content. That's where you need to be, and that's the things that you should be doing, to support yourself. And that's going to look different for every single person on the call, whether you're a parent supporting an autistic person, you are an autistic person, or the loved one, or someone that supports an autistic person. You're trying to find that for them always. If you're thinking about, well, how can I learn more about autistic culture? Because I think that was definitely the key for myself. Really embracing who I am away from my children, because I'm obviously the autistic parent of autistic children, but as an autistic person, what's really helped me embrace who I am as an autistic person, and it's really given me that strong sense of autistic stability, or that grounded feeling of this is who I am, is learning about autistic culture. And you won't find better than listening to the Incredible As I Am, which is obviously an autistic-led charity. So listening to autistic voices, going online. I know in many of my own, social media posts, I love to read the commentary, because it's all autistic people talking about their lived experience on the posts that I pop up. I love to amplify other autistic voices. I love to see what other people are saying. If anyone that knows me as I am, I love to watch webinars by autistic people, because I love to get their interpretation of whatever it is, whether it's on research or lived experience, or I've obviously a keen interest in speech and language. I'm taking a master's in speech and language, but around speech and language and Gestalt language processing, I have a keen interest in all those areas. That's all part of my culture as an autistic person. And again, you might find elements of autistic culture that don't relate to you, and that's okay too. It really is specific to each individual. Again, just the last slide you'd be delighted to hear. For me, more than anything, I think about the young Amanda that, as I say there on the really rainbowy slide, that was really unsure and confused and trying so hard all the time. And always, I could be in the busiest room, but feel like I was standing there. It's like a movie kind of clip in my mind. I could be standing there, just a matter, I could be any age, standing there and watching everything going around and trying very hard to anticipate and understand what's actually happening or what are people actually saying in conversations, and knowing that I'm still going to be lost. So for myself, knowing that I am autistic now means that I can support myself and not berate myself and say, oh, that's because you're autistic, or that not because that's because you're different. For me, it's now knowing that it's a two-way street. And it's not actually my fault when I've had difficult moments. Sometimes it could just be off the cuff and it could be my fault. But generally, I realize that it really is a two-way street in many situations. So for me, more than anything, as an autistic person, it's realizing that autistic representation does matter. And that's obviously the incredible thing about as I am being autistic led. But for me, it's having genuine, meaningful representation, and that I can really relate to, whether it's a speaker or it's a book or it's a webinar, or it's reading a really incredible social media post by an autistic person, or watching, a YouTube clip or a TikTok. For me, it's finding the culture that relates to me, and not everything that you read or watch or listen to or learn about might be specific or relate to you, but you might find elements of it to be true. So for myself, more than anything, thank you so much for listening to my, I'm only delighted to talk about myself for an hour. I hope it was helpful. And again, it wasn't obviously a theory-based webinar. It was more just a lived experience. And sometimes it's nice to maybe not listen to me, but to listen to another person speak about their lived experience. So I'll stop the share now and pop on my screen if it will come on. I hope that was helpful. Where is the button for that? Start the video. Oh, there you go. I'm back in the room. I feel like I was away somewhere looking at the screen. I hope that was helpful and wasn't too boring at all. Okay, I'm probably close to time. Sorry, Bridget. As usual, I went over time.
No. I always give you a 10-minute window.
You're like, could be here till tomorrow.
You were actually supposed to stop at 8, so you are 2 minutes early.
I mean, world record. We need to put this on the team's chat tomorrow. Amanda finished on time and not late. That happens occasionally. Do you want me to go through the questions, or what would you like?
I'll pick some out.
Okay.
So starting off, Glenn was asking what interoception was.
So interoception, I'm just going to put my email in the chat, because I know often myself, if I was on a webinar, I might feel like I don't want to ask a question, or I might think of a question later. So that's my as I am email if you want to send me a message. So interoception, really, if you think about it, again, I'm not an OT, so I won't speak to that level. But for me, it's when you're thinking about all the different sensory systems, it's the eighth sensory system. What it's really talking about is that internal sense of knowing. So for example, I deliver a lot of training around toilet learning. So if you think about, this is a very obvious example. If you needed to go to the toilet, how do you know? You might have a feeling, you might have a sense of, oh gosh, my bladder's getting full, I need to go. That's your interoceptive capacity. It's kind of linked to alexithymia as well, which is that not being able to identify your feelings. So a good example for me on interoception is a difference that I would have, and even when my lips are actually dry, is that I can never know when I'm hungry or when I'm thirsty. And despite that, I'm not actually a very thin person. But for me, the way I realized that this was actually something that wasn't that typical was during the pandemic. There was this piece on, obviously giving everyone information saying that, oh, well, if you notice you've no sense of taste and you've no sense, and I was like, what? And I was like, nothing ever tastes like anything to me. That's why I could spend the day never feeling hungry at all. And then by the evening time, I'm nearly passing out. And that's interoception differences for me. That means I'm not picking up on the body cues that I'm hungry or thirsty. And again, around sensory processing, I'm not picking up the food has a taste. That's not obviously specific to interoception, but that key piece around, so for me, for food, I would eat carbs in the evening because I'm absolutely starved, because I haven't eaten all day long. And it's usually for me, it's when I get the shakes or I see these like little stars, I'm like, did I eat? And I'm like, no, I didn't. So like today, for example, I was super busy all day. I didn't actually eat until I finished work late this evening. And then I was like, I need to start putting food out on the table, or an alarm or something going off to remind me. So that's not a great example, but if you want to email me at that email, I've great book recommendations. They're probably over my shoulder. Oh, there is actually one there over my shoulder. Sorry, that's a great book on interoception, and there's a great website, actually come up there, kellymatter.com, I think it is. kellymatter.com. And again, it's a great book, but also gives activities. But again, always follow the guidance of an occupational therapist with anything to do with sensory. And I'm not an OT. So always follow the guidance of an OT. Hope that was helpful.
Glenn was also asking about medication. We can't comment specifically on medication.
No,
there is no specific medication for autism in the same way that there might be for ADHD. You can take medication for symptoms like depression, anxiety that come up from being autistic.
Autism is your
So
neurology, it's your brain.
there's no specific medication. A $1 million question.
Okay, God.
How do you tell the difference between what is you and what is the mask that you've been wearing for however many years?
What I can say is this is going to be a lifelong question or question and answer for you to yourself to figure out. I think the way I associate, sorry, this is my fidget. You can see it. The way I would associate it is what makes me most feel content, that I don't have that anxious feeling, that I feel most like myself, that I feel most relaxed, that I just feel the most, I can only keep using that word, grounded. I feel totally at peace with myself. So for example, the piece around reading, if I was to move that camera around, you can see like floor to ceiling above me is books, all around me is books. But I was always that way as a child, and I had to decide, was that because I was trying to avoid socialization or not? And I came to the point that actually, no, I thoroughly enjoy that. And how do I know I thoroughly enjoy it? It's something I look to do, and I feel very, I was chatting to Bridget earlier about a book. I was high on life. She was like, this is not that interesting. Maybe thought it was. I was saying about a new
Never
book.
do that.
Yeah. Oh no, but I was literally like, I feel that, you know, the sense of joy, that's how I know that specific to that particular element of unmasking, that it gives me a sense of joy. And for you it might be something totally different, but I think it's something that's going to be a lifelong question that that'll always come up for me, or that I'll always have to just check in with myself. And the only way for me personally that I can understand whether I'm being myself or not, and again, there's layers. If you think about masking, there's layers to everything. To what extent are you fully true to yourself at any one time? I couldn't even begin to, that's probably the role of it, maybe a psychologist to tell me that, because it wouldn't be my role. But for me, it's that I feel the most like myself all of the time. And I would say that when I'm in the As I Am office chatting to B, as I call you, Bridget, I do feel very giddy and like just like myself, and just happier if I'm talking to Neve Mel or anybody else, my friend Gemma, anyone that I'm really good friends with, that I can just be myself. It's that sense of joy, isn't it, that you don't have to be apprehensive. That's what I would call it. That for me, it's when I'm not in the context of a social relationship, that I'm not being apprehensive or self-monitoring really at all. I'm just, you know, shooting the breeze, as they say, and being myself. I hope that was helpful.
Louise asked if, I believe she means if we could explain double empathy.
Oh, sorry, as I see it there. So double empathy, then I wouldn't have enough time to explain it the way it deserves to be explained, but in a very general, and I hope Dr. Damien Milton never hears my explanation, he'd be like, that's completely wrong. But for myself, the way I would explain it off the cuff without delivering it properly on a presentation would be to say, just generally speaking, if you're thinking about your neurology, so my neurology is that I have an autistic brain, and I'm, say, for example, I'm autistic, my daughter is not autistic. I will often have conversations with my daughter, and because she's a teenager and she would know me very well, she would say, oh no, mom, I think you think I'm saying this. This is what I'm saying. I'd be like, oh, thank you. Sorry. Yes. Or then I would double check with her if she was saying something to me, and I'd be like, oh, okay, yes. What it really is the word empathy. It's having empathy on both sides, that we're two different types of human beings communicating, socializing, trying to understand each other's perspectives, and understanding that I'll never truly know. When my daughter was starting in secondary school, I thought, God, secondary school wasn't great for me. I need to sit her down and explain as much as I can before she goes, and tell her, you need to be aware of this, that, and the other. And she's like, Mom, I know. And I was like, how do you know? And she was like, you just know. And I was like, but how do you know? And she was like, I don't know. I don't know. I saw it in a movie, maybe. I don't know. So she knew about the social world that I had no clue about until I landed myself into difficult situations. And, you know, that's an element of double empathy, in that she has lived experience that I'll never, ever have. She's a way of living in the world that will never be my natural way of living in the world. She's thought processes that aren't autistic that will never be mine. And vice versa. I live in the world in a very specific way and think about the world and all those things in a very particular way. And the double empathy piece, again, hopefully Dr. Damien Milton won't hear my explanation, a quick fire explanation, is that we're saying we live in the world, we coexist, but in two very different ways. And we can support each other by trying to understand each other and not blame each other, or you know, think negatively about each other, but instead try and understand the different perspectives, learn from each other and have empathy for each other. That was not the best explanation, but that's essentially what it is. But if you look up Dr. Damien Milton, he might actually also call it the double empathy problem. There's actually a research paper that came out. I feel like I read it last year. It could have been the 10-year anniversary. I can see it in my head. Was it 2022 or maybe January 23? That it came out last year. There's a free 10-year anniversary paper all about it. So if you even look it up on Google, type in double empathy theory, Dr. Damien Milton PDF or 10-year anniversary PDF to do that. It'll definitely come up because I read it myself last year. I hope that's helpful.
So how do you talk about the late diagnosis, either to family, extended family, outside the family? I find it's particularly hard with parents, the people who might have been responsible for having you diagnosed as a child.
Yes.
But it didn't happen.
Yeah, I think for myself, I've superbly lucky with, in particular, my dad and obviously my mom, but in particular, I'd be very close to my dad. I remember when I went for that assessment, I told them I was going to go for the assessment, and they were glad for me to go because they could see, obviously, I was landing in casualty, which isn't a great spot to go to, but there was nothing that I could be, I don't like the word diagnosed, but diagnosed with that casualty. But they were all saying in casualty, you're very unwell. We can't, through any amount of tests, find the reason why. And they were saying, maybe you're exhausted. And I was like, well, I do 4 kids, maybe I am. But they were like, but this doesn't explain this level of burnout, or they actually use the word you're burnt out, which was serendipitous in the end when I realized that I definitely was autistic. So for my dad, then I brought him over. I remember printed out the report and I gave it to him, and he was the cutest. He read it as if it was like this, and he was like, I had this little tear, and he goes, I always said you were gifted, didn't I, Mom? I always said she was gifted. And he was reading it and he was reading it and he was going, I do that. Sure, that's like me. Oh, my mind is like that. And I was like, mm-hmm. And he was like, I could be autistic. I was like, you could definitely be autistic. You're very
Very
like
well may.
so it was very it was a lovely experience. But I know there can be moments where I'm sure there's people that I actually give a great example. When I'm obviously on social media, I think since 2015. I remember putting up a post telling everyone a couple of years ago, it could have been on New Year's Eve, that I was autistic, and a person that would never ever really ever comment on my page, but I would kind of know vaguely. I remember them writing, because they would know my son Connor, who would have high support needs and is non-speaking and is autistic, and the person wrote, I don't believe that. You can't be autistic. You're nothing like Connor. And I would know that person in a present capacity. And I just thought, this is so wonderful. Thank you so much. I just thought, what a horrible thing to write on anyone's anything. And I just thought, okay, I'm not going to, I just delete that and just not reply. I know a little while later after, because I write for a column as well. It was in a local paper and I was in a store somewhere. And this would be a store I would go to all the time. And the proprietor of the store must have read it in the paper, because the paper I write for was so super supportive. They did like a full page thing talking about autism and talking about As I Am and all the incredible resources that we have here. And the lady, or the proprietor, was following me around the store and kept asking me, was I okay? And I was like, I am. She was like, are you okay? And I was like, I am. And I was like, what's going on? Because again, social, I was like, I have no idea why I'm being followed around this. And I actually was buying randomly a tin of beans. I always remember it, for my son Max, who will only eat dinner if it also has some type of a bean on the plate. And I was holding the beans going, I am. And she kept saying, are you okay? And I was like, I am. Are you okay? And there's a lot of, are you okay? And I'm okay. And I said, this is very strange. So I left the store wondering, was there something on my face, or did I fall going in the door and I'd forgotten or something? But later on that evening, my husband happened to go to the same store, and the lady said in the night, and she was being super kind. She was like, I'm so sorry. I read about Amanda in the paper. I had no idea she was mentally unwell. And he was like, sorry. And he was like, she's not mentally. What do you mean? And then he very kindly, because she is a nice woman, she's just from a different time, and he explained to her what it actually meant. So that for me meant that she thought, because I said I was autistic, that I was mentally unwell, which clearly I am not. So that was probably difficult. So for me, what I would say is, if you do encounter difficulties, whether it's family or anybody else, just know for yourself that your identification is valid, and you have to be your own best cheerleader, if that's the right language. You have to look out for yourself. You have to do what's best for yourself. And I would have been a person that, up until I was identified, and again, as a parent, it's naturally I would do what's best for my kids, but specifically in the context of myself, I never really did do what was best for me. I was always thinking about every other person's. I was thinking about my dad. So take my dad's advice, keep a little bit of that kindness back. And if you are facing unkindness, double down on your own self-compassion and the kindness to yourself, and understand that. And this is the way that I understand when I talk about, say, autistic experience, or even as a parent, that oftentimes when you have people that speak to you unkindly about whether it's your child that's autistic or for yourself if you are autistic, that often it's not mean-spirited, like that lady that thought I was unwell mentally. It's people not understanding. Oftentimes it's education or a lack of education on that particular topic, but that their heart is good. And then if it's a person that's reacting negatively, just remember sometimes people fear what they don't understand. And it could also be that they're not being a horrible person. They're just reacting to, gosh, you know, in my day, X, Y, and Z. I know my son, Connor, was with me many years ago and I spoke about this before on my own social media, in a store, and there was an older person working at the till. This was like a clothing store in Mayo. And the lady was saying, that fella there. And I didn't know who she was speaking to because there was again a person in front of me, but the lady behind me was kind of saying an F bomb, going, oh my effing, I won't even say what she said. It was quite loud and, you know, unusual. But anyway, I didn't know what was happening. And I was holding Connor's hand. I was so delighted he was able to navigate the store, and he was excited because when we would go to town, we would actually go on the, what you call them, the elevators around Castlebar, because he just liked to take a spin on them anytime we went to town, and we probably still do now, to be honest. Sorry for using everyone's electricity. But anyway, we were in the queue, we were going towards the till, and the lady then said to me, then I realized she was speaking to me, she said, that fella there, and excuse my language now for anyone, this might be triggering. She said, that fella there, is he diseased? And I said, sorry? And she goes, that fella there that's with you, is he diseased? And I said, no, he's certainly not. What do you mean, sorry? She goes, oh, I won't use the rest of the language because it was terrible. And I said, no, that's my son, he's autistic. And she said, oh, you know, in my day, we used to just put them in or put them away. And I said, what do you mean? She said, into like an institution or whatever. And I just went, oh my gosh. But because I've read and researched so much on autism for my own children, or even like I can see a book over my shoulder. I bought that book about 10 years ago. It's called Pride Against Prejudice. It was out of print at the time. I bought it from America. I just found it. I saw it there in the corner of my eye. I have read and researched so much on autism as a parent to try and help understand for my own children, because Connor has an intellectual disability, that I wanted to know as much as I could so that I could be that fountain of knowledge for my sons, or indeed for their sister as well, on autism, that I understood that the lady wasn't actually trying to be as abrasive and upsetting as obviously her words would be. I understood that from her perspective, this was quite an older person, that back in those days when she would have been growing up, that would have been the norm, unfortunately, that individuals like my son that would have an intellectual disability as well as being autistic, that he's not speaking, that was unfortunately the route that many families took for whatever reason. So I tried to educate her and tried to very compassionately speak to her, again, double empathy theory, tried to help her understand her viewpoint wasn't really accurate and was quite hurtful, but it wasn't getting anywhere. So on the way out the door, I let the manager that I would know very well at the store, just let him know what happened, not to get the lady into trouble, but to save another family that may not have spent the last 10 years reading about the history of autistic people or people with intellectual disabilities. So often I'll take the route of, this is the person that isn't as educated as myself on this, and that's okay, but their words aren't okay. So I try and educate a person, and if I can't, then I just say I cut my losses. And in that regard, I had to think of the community members in general, and that was the only reason, I suppose, after I spoke to her, that I did then speak to the manager, just in case another family would come upon her. And again, she would possibly not have had the opportunity to educate herself and could upset, you know, deeply another family or whatnot. So again, I hope that was a long-winded, rambly version of an answer. I hope it was helpful.
So for our last question before we head out for the night, do you have any tips for partners of autistic people of how they can be supportive?
I think the main thing is learning about autistic culture. It would depend on how the partner's identifying. I've probably loads of books. Do I have any there I could show you off the top of my head? There's probably billions. Actually, do I have any unmasking there I could show you? That's a great one. Now, this is more related to, Sincerely Your Autistic Child, if you're a parent watching
Very good one.
That's an excellent book. I'll just see, can I pull any books there? There's one on Kieran Rose I'm obsessed with. Here it is. Any of these two, I would read as many autistic books as you can. That's an excellent book on masking. That's an incredible book on masking. This is very research theory. This is still obviously research and theory, but this is very heavy, dense going if you're not massively into research. I would read books on autistic identity and culture. Can I pull one to give you an example? That's a great one by Pete, can I never say his last name, Pete Warmby. That's a great one. Again, you could, as a community, as a couple, pick out books to read and discuss, that would be great. Listening to autistic voices. I suppose a top tip is have compassion and understand that the person is doing their absolute best to exist. As I said, I always feel it's like a car crash once I go out the door, because there's so much coming at me immediately that I have to try and navigate and understand that the person's doing their best. Understand it and maybe learn a little bit. And again, we've some excellent resources. And as I am going to the website under resources and programs, you'll find loads of information there. I would look at being as compassionate as you can and understand that the person, think of double empathy. If you're not autistic or neurodivergent yourself, you're coming at the world two different perspectives, and each perspective is valid. But as much as you can, be the kindest type of a person that you can be for that person, because the biggest difficulty that I would have is that every single day, I'm obviously a mom as well, but every single day I'm trying to get up and live in a world that isn't meant for me. And some days, for different reasons, it's very, very overwhelming just to be me in the world and try and be the best partner and the best parent and the best human being and colleague as I can be. So having compassion. I'll pop my email in the chat again. Bridget will tell you I'm always available for a book recommendation. I essentially have a library in my house. I definitely have books I could recommend. I just don't have them right behind me. Amanda, as I am, Daddy. I'd be delighted to give book recommendations. And actually, if you contact the community support line, I know they do have book recommendation guides for child and family, and actually generally adult autism or autistic adults book recommendations, but specific to partners. I will have a look through my books. I definitely have billions, so I'm sure there's ones I could. There's nothing there. Another good one for parents to read. Actually, this is a great one. If you're trying to understand that you're autistic, I'll go off the call actually, and everyone needs to go home. Empire of Normality, that's a brand new book out this year. That's talking about this whole understanding of trying to be normal and where that actually all came from. That's a really great one. But I will definitely send out that book list to anyone that wants to email me. I'll create it tomorrow and send it out. Is there anything else there that would send out to me? Nothing else. That's another good one. If you're a parent of a teen, where's the camera? Nurturing your autistic young person. Again, these are definitely in the resources that we have on community support, but I can definitely make one around couples and partnerships and things like that if it's helpful. If you, Kevin just said he'd love to look at my library. My goodness, he would never leave. There's books everywhere. Over behind the camera, there's like floor to ceiling children's books on being autistic and being neurodivergent. So there's a lot. But anyway, I'll leave you be because I know it's getting very late. Bridget, thank you so much for being the incredible human being you are. And thank you to everyone for watching and listening. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. So this recording will be up on our YouTube. We'll also send out recordings to everyone who is here and everyone who missed it tomorrow, so everyone can go back over the slides and the information. And feel free to reach out to Amanda for book recommendations.
I definitely have at least one.
Or to the info line if you have any other questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you. Take care. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.